Hello and welcome back. It's time to talk about freedoms of a whole dizzying variety of kinds. So, of the many varieties of freedom, when people debate and even fight over freedom, and I'm sure you can think of many, many examples uh, throughout long, long history of all kinds of people fighting for, arguing for, talking about various kinds of freedoms. Almost none of those have probably ever been metaphysical freedom. I don't know that anybody's ever actually shed a drop of sweat or blood or tears over metaphysical freedom. That is the kind of freedom that we're talking about when we're talking about a variety of different kinds of definitions of free will and the attendant problems of whether those definitions are compatible with or not compatible with other kinds of things like determinism or indeterminism. And so to start us off, I've got this quotation here from a philosopher by the name of Peter von Inwagen, who's done a lot of writing about metaphysical free will, and he just details at least just some of the various different kinds of freedoms that we can start to proliferate into here. He says, because there are political constraints, there's political freedom, which exists in their absence. Because there are internal psychological constraints, such as neuroses, there is psychological freedom, which exists in their absence. And because there are economic constraints, there is economic freedom, which exists in their absence, and so on. And the context of this quotation is Inwagen saying that there are just so many different kinds of freedom beyond just metaphysical freedom, just beyond free will as a kind of abstract thing. And once we start entering into these more specific areas, we start to mean lots and lots of different things when we talk about freedom. And this is definitely what the text does. One particular section, right, starts off by talking about a very detailed way about William James's ideas of metaphysical freedom, and then kind of takes a left turn at Albuquerque and starts talking a lot about Sartre's ideas about freedom. Sartre being the famous French existentialist philosopher. What Sartre means by freedom and what William James means by freedom, or Hobart, or Stace, or Hume, or any of the other folks that we're talking about, starts to become a very, very different thing. Sartre is not really doing metaphysics. He's primarily interested in the social and political and really moral aspects of freedom, not so much in some of the metaphysical conceptual analysis that the previous part of the chapter has been mostly concerned with. But of course, these still are important philosophical issues, and so even though they start to be of a very different character in the second half of chapter 4 than they are in the first half of chapter 4, they're still worth keeping track of. And so here's one of the things that Sartre says, and again, among the many, many quotations that are given, and I think that our textbook author does an admirable job of walking through what is a very complicated reading in Sartre's Existentialism as a Humanism. So this little bit here, Sartre says this. He says, man is nothing else than his plan. He exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself. He is therefore nothing else than the ensemble of his acts, nothing else than his life. It's a very characteristically existentialist thing. One of my old professors explained existentialism this way. He says, it starts with the idea that, number one, you know you're going to die, and you know everybody that you know is going to die, and you think about how much do you even know about your own great-grandparents? Right? And the fact that you don't probably know very much, if anything, about your own great-grandparents. Maybe you know all of their names. Maybe you know a few things about them. But again, think of what that is in comparison to a whole life. And if this depresses you, right, you're not alone. This is what's called having an existential crisis, right? Saying, look, my time here is short. My significance is, in the grand scheme of things, very small. What do I do in the face of that? And this is where Sartre says that there's this kind of radical freedom here, and it's as much freedom as it is responsibility, right? He says, look, you don't have a lot of it, so you gotta get it right. You gotta make it mean something, and the way that he sort of advises going about that process is again very characteristically existentialist. And so it seems that human beings are free in this moral sense, right, to determine what is valuable because at least for Sartre here, it's not determined for them by God. Sartre is an atheist. He doesn't think there is a God. He says, or really by anything else. He says nobody has some definitive idea of what is good or valuable. And so that means that you have to decide, and you bear the responsibility for what you decide, right? If you decide poorly, that's bad. And if you decide well, that's good. But you don't get to crib the answers from anybody else. It's your call. And again, that's a kind of radical, what he says, sort of moral freedom in some sense. And that's largely the kind of freedom that Sartre is talking about here, a kind of moral freedom. And again, don't skip the primary source readings here. I can't replace them. I can't really summarize them easily. Like I said, I think our textbook author's done a reasonable job of cutting that down, making it a little bit more accessible, and giving you a start in looking at some of these really complicated and interesting issues. And the text continues into a discussion about sort of a different form of freedom, a kind of idea of freedom from oppression, right? This is maybe in some ways related to the kind of moral freedom that Sartre talks about. But again, we've gone way past a metaphysical freedom, or freedom in its most abstract sense, in terms of the kind of conceptual analysis we were doing as the chapter started. And so let's talk a little bit about oppression as a kind of opposite of freedom, so that you can see what kind of freedom the absence of oppression is really intended to be. So the analysis of oppression as a piece of vocabulary has played a large role in the way that things have turned out over the course of the last 100 years or so. It's been something that people have grown more and more conscious of, and it's become something that people have found a lot of value in paying more attention to. The textbook quotes Marilyn Frye, a prominent feminist scholar, as defining oppression in this way. It's a system of interrelated barriers and forces which reduce, immobilize, and mold people who belong to a certain group and affect their subordination to another group. It's a very broad definition, but I think it catches a lot of what we mean when we talk about oppression. And this isn't exactly the place for like a really thorough breakdown of every possible aspect there is to oppression, but our goal here is to give you a good understanding of where to start, right? To then start digging in a little bit deeper. And again, the text goes into much more detail than I can go into here. And so to add to this, oppression has this effect, right? Not of limiting metaphysical freedom, but of limiting options. Okay, so consider as an example some of the constraints placed on people who were enslaved in history, because again, this is I trust fairly familiar, especially to audiences educated, growing up, living in the United States. This is something again well known about American history, is that there was an institution of slavery for a fairly long period of time. And a fair bit is known about it. I mean, it's a common topic in schools. It's, again, a major part of American history. You can't really understand most of American history without understanding conflicts over and concerning slavery. So consider an enslaved person in this kind of a situation. In some sense, if we're talking about metaphysical freedom, that is the kind of the ability to make choices and carry them out. Everybody has that, right? That in some sense, you can't really abridge that short of like literally chaining people up, which of course enslaved people were at times, right? They when they were chained up, they weren't free to move about, but there's so many other things that they weren't free to do, but when we say not free to do, we don't mean in a metaphysical way. We don't mean that they literally couldn't do those things. They were prevented physically from doing those things. We meant that there were certain consequences to doing those things that were so bad that most people didn't risk it, right? So, for example, simply leaving, simply running away. Now, of course, we know many, many enslaved people did in fact run away at any opportunity that they were given, or at least at the best opportunities that they saw presented to them. But many didn't on a day-to-day basis necessarily, because, again, the consequences of doing so were so bad that it was not necessarily a live option, right? Or people didn't necessarily consider it to be an option. That's more what Frye means by sort of oppression, as in not a limiting of metaphysical freedoms necessarily, but this limiting of options. And so let's talk a little bit more about that kind of limiting of options. And this becomes a really important part of the analysis, is this notion of oppressive systems rather than specific oppressive instances, right? And this is, again, very, very important to modern analyses. So again, Frye uses this metaphor, I think, is really well thought out, and it really illustrates the issue well. This metaphor of a bird cage. And she uses that to describe oppressive social structures. She writes, "The bird could avoid any single wire of the cage. One must examine the cage for a while in order to see why it is that the bird cannot escape the cage. The microscopic view fails to demonstrate how the wires of the cage, along with its base and its latched door, work together to restrict the bird's movement. Only by adopting the macroscopic view are the relations between and among those pieces evident." And again, I think this illustration is very illuminating. The idea is that when we see at least large-scale examples of oppressive social orders or oppressive social structures, it's never just any one thing. Right? It's always lots of different things that are working together in ways that are hard to see when you're looking at too small of a scale. You start to have to look at a very big scale to sort of, put some of those things together, see how they work together. I mean, like I said, I could probably go through quite a number of examples, but again, the text goes through some detail, and I imagine you probably have some ideas of how this kind of thing works in your mind already. I do want to mention just one example to flesh things out a little bit. And again, if we're looking at much of the 20th century, one of the kinds of oppression that, again, is most obvious to looking backwards is racial oppression. For much of the 20th century, in much of the country, there were all kinds of not just laws, but social customs, including things like company policies, store policies, certain shops that wouldn't provide their services to people based on their race. There were, again, banking policies where, certain kind of banks wouldn't provide their services to people based on their race. Home loans were provided only in certain areas to people based on their race, etc. So again, it's never just any one thing. There's always lots of things that tend to work together. And one artifact of this just has to do with just the simple act of taking a vacation, which is maybe one of the most characteristically sort of American things of the 20th century, right? The American vacation is all the way through film, all the way through literature, all the way through American culture in such a way that people who are Americans don't necessarily think of anything special about taking a vacation. But again, it's a very characteristically American phenomenon. Not that non-Americans don't take vacations, but again, there's a very particular expression of the vacation that is very, very much an American thing. And so, but if you look at the experience of Black Americans through much of the 20th century, even though they were metaphysically free to go on vacation, as in, in general, they were not locked in rooms or chained up or things like that. I mean, by and large, there were still lots of restrictions, right? They were not essentially free in a broader sense, in a social sense, to stay a night anywhere they wanted, or to eat somewhere where they wanted, or to buy food wherever they wanted, or et cetera. That's there's all kinds of constraints, some of which were legal constraints in some parts of the country, others of which were merely social constraints. That is, people that would react badly or refuse to provide a service, or those sorts of things, and they would do that out of again, social pressures, or these are again social restrictions or economic restrictions. Sometimes they're legal restrictions, but sometimes not. And so these the image you see on the left hand side of the image is a reproduction, right, of something that was distributed fairly widely throughout the middle of the 20th century for a number of years, called a Green Book. It was published by Victor Green, which is, I imagine, where it gets its name. And the whole idea of the Green Book was to tell Black Americans who were going on vacation or traveling somewhere with which they weren't already familiar, where they could actually stop to buy fuel or food, or where they could stay a night, or various things like that, because again, broader society was not friendly to that proposition. And so again, the reason we see articles of this kind is because of a kind of social repression, a kind of oppression. And again, when you're looking at oppression, it's never just any one thing, right? There's no single policy or practice that you can point to and say, that was the oppression. It was the way that it all tended to work together that gives you the oppression. And so again, I think this the birdcage metaphor we saw in the previous slide is illuminating. And so again, I think this example starts to flesh out what somebody might be talking about when they're talking about oppression. They're talking about having a set of live options. And the thing that people the world over have wanted from their societies is the ability to be full participants in their society, no matter their background or their gender or their sexual orientation or their race or religion, or a whole variety of things that have come to the public attention in the sense that people. Some groups of people have been denied these kinds of live options, right? The ability to just, have the number of live options that dominant groups of the society have had for quite a long time. Of course, this is not to say that all forms of social constraint are bad. And that's where this is a very, very complex philosophical and social and political issue. And so I just wanted to very briefly mention, because we're going to talk about this in much more detail later in the course, the basic idea of a social contract. And what you see, the image on the right is the cover of, or a cover of, an edition of a book by a fellow by the name of Thomas Hobbes called The Leviathan. It's a very, very famous thing, and it sort of starts off in the Western world this notion of a social contract. And again, I don't want to spoil the material for later, but very briefly, Hobbes has this view where he asks you to imagine. He just says, imagine what life is like without any laws, without any government, without any social restrictions, right? And I think that if you're thinking, well, it could be pretty dangerous if people just do whatever they want, then I think you're right? That's what Hobbes thought it was going to be like too, and I think we have very good reasons for believing that that's what it would be like. If we look at various places around the world and around history where things like law and order and social, structures have broken down, they tend to be very dangerous, violent places you don't want to live, because you can't really live a normal life. And so the idea is that even if in this state there's the maximum amount of freedom in the sense that there's no social or legal restrictions, right? I mean, it sounds like you have lots of freedom. In reality, you don't have lots of freedom in the sense that you don't have very many live options. So if you decide, well, I'd love to just be a painter and paint my pictures, that's great until somebody just kills you and takes your paintings, right? Say, I've always wanted to farm. I love to farm the land, to tend the crops, to watch them grow. And that's great until somebody kills you and takes your crops, right? So again, really in Hobbes's imaginings here, this sort of like state of anarchy, right? You don't have any live options other than to, kill or be killed. That's if you don't spend all of your time trying to guard your life with your life, that's it. That's all you got. And that's no life, right? That's no valuable existence that anybody really wants. And so what we do is we say, okay, fine, we're going to allow an organization, right? Hobbes calls it the Leviathan. We're gonna have some entity whose job it is to try and enforce a kind of some rules, right? No killing, no stealing, no beating people up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And and if we can have that, well, then all of a sudden, if everybody, right, is equally prevented from doing those kinds of things, well, then now all of a sudden we have all kinds of live options, and all of the potential for peaceful cooperation, and all of the great benefits that that provides, all of a sudden now that's available to everybody. And one of the things we've seen from the various social and political movements of the last 100+ years has been that we liked as many people to have as many live options as they can have, and that the kinds of freedoms that we think are very valuable really are most valuable when they are for everybody. And that's where a study of things like oppression is very profitable. Right? It can lead to giving us some ideas about how to make the world a fundamentally better place.